made sure that we haven't had any of the strikes that have taken place south of the border. He's reached an accommodation with the health unions.
3 students and 3 adults have been killed in a shooting at a private Christian school in the US city of Nashville. Police say a female suspect, who was 28 and carrying 2 assault rifles plus a pistol, was also shot dead at the scene. Jeremy Corbyn has accused the Labour leader of denigrating the democratic foundations of the party by blocking him from standing at the next general election. Sir Keir Starmer says he will propose a motion aiming to stop Mr Corbyn being endorsed by the National Executive Committee. And the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, has praised Israel's decision to pause plans to reform the country's judiciary. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, had wanted to change the way judges are appointed, but critics called the move a power grab. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 66 points at 74.72. The pound buys $1.23 and €1.14. LBC weather, rain and wind in the west overnight. There could be some frost in the north and also the east, a low of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Tim Daly.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and a warm welcome to Monday's Cross Question on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. Let me tell you who's on the panel with me. Lisa Nandy is Labour's Shadow Levelling Up Secretary and MP for Wigan. Sir Robert Buckland is Conservative MP for Swindon South and former Cabinet Minister. Ben Nunn, former Labour Party Executive Director of Communications under Sir Keir Starmer and is now Senior Counsel for Lexington Communications. And Annabel Denham joins us, Deputy Comment Editor for the Daily Telegraph. The number to call, as you know, 0345 60 973, and you can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 60 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first call. It's Dean in Glasgow. Hello, Dean.
Hi Ian, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. What would you like to say?
Yeah, what I would like to say, in light of the election that we've had up here in Scotland with Humza Yousaf being elected the leader of the SNP, and tomorrow, most likely the First Minister, do the panel agree that the question of independence is not going away, and if Labour have any hope of winning seats up here in Scotland, they need to readdress their stance on independence. I absolutely understand if you have unionist views, absolutely fine, but I don't think if you're a Democrat, if nationalist parties win election after election after election, how can you justify telling the Scottish people, no, you're not allowed to have a referendum?
OK. Lisa Nandy.
I thought you might be looking at me.
Well, in the absence of a Scot on the panel.
I know it's poor. It's poor showing, Ian.
I know. Sorry, it's my fault.
I mean, look, I think that the election of Humza Yousaf is it's a mark of a continuity of what's gone before. He was a key part of Nicola Sturgeon's team. He served in several key briefs over recent years in the Scottish Government, during which time we've had a referendum on independence, which the SNP said themselves was a once-in-a-generation chance to make a decision. And the result of that referendum came in. Now, I like to think I've got consistency on this. I didn't support a second referendum on Brexit. I didn't support a second referendum on Scottish independence. And the reason is that I think we've found multiple ways to divide ourselves from one another over the last decade. But this country is falling apart at the seams. And people in Scotland have had the worst of all worlds, because not only have they had an appalling government at Westminster, they've also had a government at Holyrood that has failed on health, failed on justice, failed on transport. Don't believe me, believe Kate Forbes, who was just narrowly beaten for leader of the SNP just a few hours ago, who said that herself about the man who's just about to become the First Minister of Scotland and the briefs that he held. I think there is a chance now for this country to move forwards. Labour is determined that we're going to show that we're going to use the full might of the United Kingdom to deliver for the people of Scotland. And there is now, with Keir Starmer leading the Labour Party and Anna Sowar leading the Scottish Labour Party, a chance for the Scottish people to rid themselves of this government at Westminster and start to turn things around.
Now, obviously, there is no SNP representative on this panel, so I'm going. It falls to me to put forward some arguments that they would put forward. You are consistent in your stance on referendums, but they would say, yes, but the circumstances have changed. We were told that if we voted to stay in the United Kingdom, we would stay in the EU. And there was, of course, the Brexit referendum. We're no longer in the EU. They've also won every election since then with a mandate for a referendum. And the Conservatives are saying, yes, but constitutionally, we'll come to Robert in a moment, the expert on the Constitution, but constitutionally, it's within the Westminster government's powers to prevent another referendum. And that is correct. But when you have a mandate, particularly in the last Scottish Parliament, where a majority of the MPs support independence, if you include the Greens, if you just say, well, no, we're not going to respect that democratic mandate, that isn't necessarily going to encourage more people to vote Labour in Scotland, is it?
Look, I accept that the question of Scotland's future is never closed, that this is a live debate in Scotland and it's a live debate across the United Kingdom, and it's right and proper that it should be. But the question that Scottish nationalist politicians have to answer is, do they think realistically that Scotland would be back in the European Union as an independent country? There are huge outstanding questions about whether they would be able to use, which currency they would use, about questions about the economy and whether it's in the best interest of the Scottish people, none of which they're prepared to answer. And what I'm not prepared to do is countenance the idea that somehow they've won a mandate for a second referendum when they're not prepared to answer those basic questions, and when they went into many of those elections saying you cannot be a nationalist and you can vote for us. I think the challenge for the whole political class in every part of the United Kingdom is to show that this country can work for people in every part of the United Kingdom, and that's what we're determined to do.
Robert Buckland, you were Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor. You had the Constitution, I think, under your remit there. The question is really about if Labour want to win seats in Scotland, they've got to readdress their stance on independence. But the same question could go to the Conservatives as well.
Well, first of all, I want to pay personal tribute to Humza Yousaf. He was my opposite number as Justice Secretary in Scotland, so we worked together very closely, particularly during COVID, and I think it's a personal achievement for him. Let's not take that away from him. However, he inherits a very difficult position for the people of Scotland, because I am absolutely convinced that the people of Scotland aren't genetically different from the rest of us and the rest of the UK, and they care about the same things that we do, which is the cost of living, the security of our country, what's happening in Europe, in Ukraine, the future for their kids. It's exactly the same concerns that we have in England or Wales or Northern Ireland. And I really do have to ask the question, with the SNP talking about the Constitution all the time, is that really what the people of Scotland
won every election.
Want to hear? But as I agree with Lisa on this one, they made an appeal, not just based upon the independence question, but upon a vote that allowed people to identify and put Scotland first, rather than automatically voting yes in a referendum. And I think just keeping this issue alive and open all the time actually serves nobody's interests any good. If you look currently at the trends in the opinion polls, they're moving away from this support for independence. And I think that's because people really are fed up with this question being asked all the time. On the law, the Supreme Court, I think, came to the only reasonable decision that it could do about the operation of the law, which was that this is indeed a matter for the United Kingdom government, and that I think the Scottish Lord Advocate herself knew that, in having to ask the question of the court, there was a real doubt about the ability, or the competence, as we say, of the Scottish government to be able to do its own referendum. Thankfully, they've not chosen to go down the path that Catalonian politicians went down some years ago, which I think was very divisive and very dangerous. And I do, applaud them for that. But really, I think it's time now, with a new First Minister, for them to change the record and talk about what people actually care about in Scotland, which is jobs, the cost of living, and the future for their families.
Annabel Denham, Tim Stanley wrote an interesting article in your paper today. Headline, "The SNP might be in trouble, but unionism is still at risk of dying out." Just explain his thesis in that, because I think that it was a very, very interesting one.
Yes.
I was very annoyed about it because I wanted to write a column about the SNP today, but I was told I couldn't.
I think his overarching premise is that regardless of the outcome of today of the leadership contest, that Nicola Sturgeon's Scotland will live on. His argument is that she's managed to detach people's loyalties from localism and instead divert it towards nationalism, and that has allowed the nationalist cause to endure. I mean, when it comes to my sort of own views of the future of independence, I think it's a matter for the Scottish people, actually. I accept that things have fundamentally changed, constitutionally changed significantly since they voted in 2014. I don't buy a lot of the economic arguments that are put against independence. I actually think that Scotland could thrive outside of the Union, just in the same way that some Scandinavian nations with similar populations do. But I think that independence has become less likely now that Humza Yousaf is the First Minister of Scotland. Let's not forget that vote was very close. We're very familiar, aren't we, here in the United Kingdom with 52-48. It was only a few tens of thousands of SNP members who backed Humza Yousaf. It was not the resounding victory that he was expecting. I don't think that he's going to take the Scottish people with him. And in any case, even if he does, he actually extended Nicola Sturgeon's timeline. So he's saying that it'll be another referendum within 5 years. So let's see what happens.
I think the interesting thing is if Kate Forbes had won, and I must admit I thought she was going to in the end, but she obviously didn't. If she had won, she could have, I think, attracted quite a lot of Conservative voters across to the SNP, because the SNP has always been seen as a left-wing party. But clearly, if you listen to what she said about economics in the debates, I mean, she's kind of, I won't say sub-Tory, but she's certainly much more right of centre on the economy than Humza Yousaf is. But of course, she's not going to do that now. And I mean, that could have, I mean, playing into Tim Stanley's headline there, that could have been serious for the Scottish Conservatives and indeed Scottish Labour.
Sure. I mean, I don't know how likely it ever was that you'd see a defection of Kate Forbes to the Scottish Conservatives, really. And I think that the counter-argument to that would be that you might have seen some sort of unsure, wavering SNP voters actually move across to the Labour Party because they didn't want to vote for what they would view as a tartan Tory. So I think it can, you can argue that one both ways. But certainly I think it would have been in the best interest of the Scottish people to have had Kate Forbes in charge. She, to me, seems like the most competent leader of all of those who threw their hat in the ring during this contest.
Ben Nunn, I was talking to quite a senior Labour MP today who said effectively our champagne corks were popping when Nicola Sturgeon resigned, because, I mean, it's just a gift to the Labour Party in many ways, isn't it?
No, it's not a gift. And I'd hold off on the champagne corks until Labour actually wins an election. It's an opportunity.
Sorry, you don't work for them anymore.
Yeah, it's an opportunity. It's definitely a massive opportunity. I don't agree with anything really much that Nicola Sturgeon stands for. I think her project of independence is flawed. I think her track record in government is terrible. However, she was a giant of Scottish politics and of British politics, and I think she was probably the best political communicator we've had in this country since Tony Blair. So I think she's a massive loss to the SNP. She's a massive loss to the Yes movement. And I think that presents an opportunity for Labour to gain seats in Scotland and to use those seats to help form a majority. But it's not a given at all. I think sometimes we slightly patronise voters and think just because, that it's as simple as change in heads or change in leaders, you've got to win the case, you've got to make the argument. And although I don't agree with Dean, I do agree that Labour has got to make the positive case for why the people of Scotland should vote Labour. And I think we have failed to do that over the past decade.
I think the reason why the MP that I was talking to was sort of rather more optimistic than you appear to be was that if Keir Starmer's to get a sizable majority, Scotland is absolutely crucial to that. It means that the percentage vote in England can be that much less if you're getting 20, 25 seats in Scotland, whereas at the moment you've only got one.
Yes, it is. I wouldn't call it crucial, actually, but it is incredibly important. But what I think is what's changed over the past 2 years, and where the opportunity lies for the Labour Party now, is over the last 10 years we haven't been seen as credible in England and Wales because of the vote share. If you live in Scotland, it's like, what is the point of voting Labour? You're not going to get a majority in England and Wales, and so it's a wasted vote. That's changed. Labour is credible in England and Wales. Keir is a credible Prime Minister in waiting. So that is why it's an opportunity, because there is a real reason you can actually say a vote for Labour is actually worth it this time, whereas in previous elections, I think, frankly, it hasn't been.
Never use that phrase, Prime Minister in waiting. Remember the last one that used that? Robert, you remember?
Gosh, I'm gonna say Neil Kinnock.
Roy Jenkins back in the
goodness
SDP Alliance days.
Oh yes, do you remember? That
ended well, didn't it?
That ended very.
We've had a lot of non-success stories in the Labour Party since then.
Right, we are going to thank you very much, Dean, for your call. We're going to move on in just a second. It is 8:16 on LBC.
This is LBC.
We have Annabel Denham, Deputy Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph, with us, Ben Nunn, Senior Counsellor at Lexington Communications, Sir Robert Buckland, Conservative MP for Swindon South and former Justice Secretary, and Lisa Nandy, Shadow Levelling Up Secretary and MP for Wigan. Whenever I say shadow levelling up, can you promise me here and now that if you become a cabinet minister in that department, you will rename it back to what it was?
It is my first demand of Prime Minister Starmer, a job title that can fit on the screen when you appear.
I mean, what was wrong with communities and local government?
Just anything.
Yeah, good one. I'm glad we agree on that. Right, let's go to another caller. It's Anthony in Staines. Anthony, what would you like to ask?
Yes, hi Ian and hi panel. Following Hamza Yousaf's victory as First Minister in today's election, and with three of the highest offices in the country held by Asian candidates, PM and Mayor of London, what does this tell us about this attitude's country to race and ethnicity?
Annabel, let's start with you on this, because I think it is quite significant. I mean, in a sense, it's one of those things where you think, well, if you don't comment on it, it's just seen as natural, but I think it is worth commenting on, isn't it?
I suppose so, although the fact that we almost don't think it's not worth commenting on, or almost don't think it's not worth commenting on, suggests to me that it just isn't a big deal in our multicultural society that we now have a Muslim Minister of Scotland, a Muslim Mayor of London, and a Hindu Prime Minister. I think it shows what a progressive society we've become here in the UK, and it's of course it's absolutely something to be welcomed. And this is coming off the back of the Casey report last week, and so many suggestions, absolutely appalling stuff that was coming out of that about the behaviour of some members of our police force, and to have this positive news about how tolerant we are, as a society, how far we've managed to come in really such a short space of time. It's really, really positive news.
I read earlier today that Humza Yousaf is the first Muslim leader of any European country, which isn't. Whatever you think of Scottish independence, that is something that he can be really proud of, I think. Ben?
I totally agree. I actually think I understand he's the first Muslim leader of any country in the Western world. I think it's a tremendous achievement. And I totally agree with Annabel in that one of the best things about it is the fact that we're not surprised. And I think it shows that we are there's undoubtedly racism in this country, and there's an awful long way to go. But we are a more tolerant country than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. So I think it's a fantastic achievement.
I sense there's going to be a bit of unanimity here, so we'll keep this one brief. Robert?
Well, yes, look, I think Ben's right to just caution ourselves about not getting too, slapping each other on the back and saying, isn't it marvellous, job done? There's still a long way to go, as we've seen, in certain corners of our society. There's still some very unattractive behaviours.
But in politics, you could say it's job done. When you look at the ethnic makeup of the House of Commons now, I don't know how many non-white cabinet members there are now, but under Boris Johnson there were 6 or 7. Actually out of proportion, if you like, to the proportion in the population. But I wonder whether there are, as you say, other sectors of society that have got to catch up.
Well, I think if you're looking at the private sector, there's probably still questions about boards and directorships and things like that. And I think companies themselves are looking to see how they can improve that. And perhaps now, rather than just talking about diversity, about what we look like and what we represent, diversity of thought, I think, is also very important as well. And that isn't just about political opinion. That's about, frankly, neurodiverse people, autistic people who are excluded at the moment. We're not doing enough to help them and allow them to realise their potential. Let's widen this debate out to really embrace, difference and celebrate it in its fullest sense.
Lisa?
I think Humza Yousaf's election is enormously significant, actually, and I think it's worth commenting on. I think, when Rishi Sunak became the Prime Minister, I won't deny that I felt really emotional about it. I grew up in the 1980s.
That could be read two ways.
My dad's from India. I'm mixed race. I'm proudly half Indian. And I never, ever in my life thought I would see what we've seen happen over the last few years, that we have British Asians serving as Prime Minister, as First Minister of Scotland, and as the Mayor of London. And I think it's worth commenting on till the cows come home, because it's such an important moment for kids like me and kids growing up today. But I would, just picking up on Ben's point, I would say this as well. It says something about the British public that I think they're better than politicians give us credit for. Some politicians, I wouldn't include any of the present company in that. And it should be a caution to some of the current crop of politicians that the culture wars will find short thrift with the majority of the British public. But the Mayor of London has armed police everywhere that he goes because of the level of racist threats that he has to put up with. And there are people in this country, let's not kid ourselves, who aren't just dealing with racism and discrimination. They're also dealing with discrimination on the grounds of their gender. They're dealing with discrimination on the grounds that they're poor. If you're a poor Muslim woman, ask yourself, is there a path to reach the heights that Humza Yousaf has proudly reached? I think that's very limited at the moment, and I don't think we should rest until we've dealt with the fact that some people don't just face some discrimination, some serious discrimination, but they face discrimination from many, many quarters, and that Britain is a better country than that, and that we need to strive to do better.
Anthony, thank you very much for your question. Let's take this Alexa question from Nikki, who says, what on earth could Tory MPs, past and present, be giving to foreign companies for £10,000 a day? Now, this is we call it a sting operation by a website called Lions Led by Donkeys. It was in the Observer yesterday. And they approached, I think, 16 MPs, and two of them wanted to charge this Korean company £10,000 a day for consultancy services. Matt Hancock was one. Kwasi Kwarteng was another. And then two others, Sir Graham Brady and Stephen Hammond, they also sort of offered their services but a much cheaper rate. Robert, I don't know if you were approached for this, being an ex-minister, but I mean, it astonishes me that they don't see this sort of thing coming.
Well, I entirely agree, and I think that the individuals concerned will be ruining the day that they didn't at least check and try and find out a bit more about, shall we say, Greeks bearing gifts, without any disrespect to all my Greek friends. It's the Trojan horse issue. But coming back to it, no, I mean, look, I personally, I know we might have a big debate about this. I think that it's okay for MPs to have other interests, particularly if they've had a pre-existing qualification like a doctor or an accountant or something like that, or dare I say a lawyer like me. That I think is okay. What I think becomes difficult is where the outside interests then overwhelm the duties you have as an MP to your constituents. I don't think that's right. I think that's getting the balance in time.
But what do you think this company, I mean, obviously it's a fake company, but what would they expect for, £10,000 a day? Even as a highly qualified barrister, you wouldn't be charging £10,000 a day.
No, nowhere near. And I just don't know where these figures would come from. And having seen some of the footage...
Greed, that's where they come from.
Well, look, I'm not going to judge my fellow colleagues, but I really think the whole thing, you can say what you like it, but I think the whole thing was ill-advised, and frankly, those sort of things. If you're approached by a reputable recruitment consultant who might be able to negotiate, okay, but really, these MPs should have been far more careful about who they were dealing with, and really thought, long and hard before started to have those sort of conversations. It's not ended well.
You've declared outside earnings of £4,000 a month with a law firm. Does that not impact on your ability to do your parliamentary job properly?
No, I think, in fact, it helps, because I was a lawyer for many years before I became an MP. Like a doctor, I don't want to lose my qualification. I think that the role that I have there will be about law and about the development of legislation. I think, actually, it supplements very well the work that I continue to do for my constituents. My main job is being an MP. And let's not forget, I had a second job. For years, I was a minister and a Secretary of State, which was an all-consuming, overwhelming job, and I still worked hard for my constituents on their casework and all their individual
But people
concerns.
will say that you're being paid almost as much per month as you're being paid by the taxpayer for being an MP there. So it's almost a first job. No,
it's not. The overall rate is way below the amount of money that I get as an MP. That interest does not exceed my work as an MP.
My maths are clearly at fault.
4,000 a month is just under £50,000. Yeah. As an MP, I get paid over £80,000. That is my office, that is my main job, and I make no apology for, as a lawyer, pursuing a legal career.
Lisa, you have outside earnings from book royalties. Does that? I mean, that's obviously slightly different, but I'm not sure you'd be able to retire on book royalties being a former publisher.
I did a book with your company years ago. Yeah. We sold virtually nothing, I think. Still available in notebook bookshops anyway.
Obviously my fault, but
but
Labour's policy is to ban second jobs.
Yeah, so I wrote a book recently, obviously having been in Parliament for 13 years through multiple scandals like this. I've thought about this quite a lot over the years. I think the biggest problem with what we saw in the Led by Donkeys investigation and what we've seen before is that MPs are currently allowed to act as paid lobbyists if they declare, as long as they declare their interest at the same time as being members of Parliament. And you're first duty as a Member of Parliament is to your constituents and to the country as a whole. And if you're acting as a paid lobbyist, is that compatible with putting your constituents and the country as a whole first? I don't think it is. And so I have come to the conclusion that the only way to resolve this is to legislate. I think we should legislate to ban second jobs, but I think we should make a few limited exceptions. And, well, I mean, you could quite simply say no second income. So say you offered me a book contract, which I did with the book that we did for your company, could just give it to charity. That's what we did. It was just easier. I earn enough. My constituents are really struggling at the moment. I don't think it's helpful to anyone, least of all me and the integrity of the political system, to be trying to make more money. So, but at the moment, there are no clear rules about it. And I think the best thing that you could do is to legislate to say no second jobs, perhaps no second income at all, with a few limited exceptions where you have to keep up professional registration. My colleague Rosanna Allen-Khan, for example, works in an A&E department. I think I do actually agree with Robert. I think there are some professions where you have to keep your professional registration up, where that is actually in the interests of the public, because I would warrant to say she's a better MP for being able to report from the front line, and for the rest of us, go and volunteer in other walks of life if you've got time on your hands. But otherwise, let's not muddy the waters. It's time to clean this up once and for all.
So David Lammy shouldn't be paid for his stints at LBC?
Well, I think the simplest thing would be to say no outside income, because otherwise, as you said, there's a problem with defining what constitutes a second job.
And indeed, he won't be on Sunday because I'm sitting in for him.
Well, I won't ask how much you're going to be paid. What I would say, though, is that doing a radio phone-in show, I think, can be a really good supplement to how well you do your job as a Member of Parliament. It'd be a good way to connect with the public. But why don't we come together and agree that we don't need outside income for those things, that perhaps we donate it to charity, perhaps there's a solution that we could find. But I don't think this system is benefiting anyone, least of all the integrity of the political system.
Right, I'm going to give you two a free pass on this, Ben and Annabel, because I want to move on to something else in just a moment because we're a bit late for the news. It's 8:32. Let's go to Tim Daly for the news headlines.
The new leader of the SNP says he will ask for another independence referendum right away when he's formally elected as Scotland's First Minister tomorrow. Humza Yousaf narrowly beat Kate Forbes once second preference votes were taken into account. Police in Nashville say a gunman at a school where 3 children and 3 adults were shot dead is a former student. Officers killed the 28-year-old woman who was carrying 2 assault rifles and a pistol. And Britain is welcoming a move by the Israeli Prime Minister to delay a judicial overhaul, which has sparked huge protests across the country. Benjamin Netanyahu says he's pausing the proposals to avoid civil war through dialogue. LBC weather, rain and wind in the west overnight, and there could be some frost in the north and east as well. A low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC.
Evan says, Lisa Nandy for PM, been thinking this for years. Hope it happens one day. Well, there you go. I didn't know you lived in Devon, Ben. But, right, we have Lisa Nandy with us, Sir Robert Buckland, Ben Nunn and Annabel Denham. Now, I have to say that after the next break, Lisa and Robert have to leave us because they have to go and do their duty and vote in the House of Commons. So I want to fit in as much in the next 10 minutes as we can. But Annabel, you just did want to have a quick word on MPs' second jobs.
Yes, I think the wider issue is that we don't pay our parliamentarians enough. If we expect them to be fully committed to their constituents, then we probably need to pay them more than £84,000 a year. Now, I accept their salaries are way above the national average, but do we not want to attract the most talented people like Lisa and Robert into Parliament in order to ultimately
notice how silent they're being.
Exactly. In order to scrutinise legislation and to represent their constituents. This is a very important job, and I think that the fact that we underpay MPs suggests that we don't take it seriously enough. However, I accept that the idea of increasing MP salaries to say £130,000 a year, if not more, would be completely unpalatable to the British public. So if we have to accept the status quo, then I think it's entirely reasonable for MPs to have second jobs.
Ben?
I think there is a question about present company excluded, about the talent that we're attracting to Parliament. Oof. And I said present company not excluded. I'm not quite Ben from Devon, but I'm not far off. I think there is a question about how, because it is, and Lisa and Robert don't have to say this, but other people should. It is a really tough job being a member of Parliament. The abuse, the hours, the challenges.
Let's move on. Hassan is in Cambridge. Hassan, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi there, Iain. So now that Corbyn and other leftist candidates have been prevented from standing as MPs and councillors, is it time for the left of the party to form a new movement or a party which can address the needs of the millions that are suffering from Tory misrule and have been abandoned by Keir Starmer's sort of a policy platform?
Lisa Nandy.
No, it's not, because they haven't. I mean, we've had a series of selections going on across the country over the last few months. We're getting ready to fight the next election, and we're determined to be ready when that happens. We've had candidates from all wings of the party selected by members in different parts of the country. One of my friends, Chris Webb, has just been selected in Blackpool. I don't think you could call Chris Webb from the right of the party. I think he's been a proud trade unionist and a fighter for social justice. There are lots of people across our party and across our movement who speak for the whole country when you put them together in a political party. And I think that what you're seeing happening in the Labour Party and what you've seen happen over the last few years is a recognition that in 2019 we catastrophically lost the trust of the British people. We had our worst election result in 100 years. We lost working class votes across the country because people didn't believe fundamentally they'd be safe in our hands. And we vowed, Keir Starmer vowed, I vowed, many of us in the shadow cabinet vowed at that moment, never ever again would we leave the people that formed our party again.
Banning Jeremy Corbyn, somebody who Keir Starmer called his friend not so long ago, does that warrant banning Jeremy Corbyn from standing in the constituency that he's represented since 1983?
Well, this is a question for the National Executive Committee. For those who don't know about the Labour internal machinations of the Labour Party, this is a democratically elected body that's made up of representatives from the membership, from trade unions and from the Parliamentary Labour Party. They will get a decision tomorrow about whether Jeremy Corbyn can stand as a Labour candidate. This has been going on for too long.
And what's your view?
Well, my view is that never again, as the EHRC report said...
on this, on Corbyn being able to stand as an MP.
My view is that, as the EHRC report said, that friends and factions around the leader should not be trying to influence decisions about who stands. It is a question for the National Executive Committee. They're democratically elected, and we've got to move on as a party.
This
for the last few years,
is in the name
all
of
we've
Keir
done...
Starmer.
It's right for the leader of the party to take it to the National Executive Committee. As a member of his shadow cabinet,
why can't you endorse that?
Well, because it's not my call. It's the call of the NEC. They're democratically elected. They make a decision on every candidate at the election, including me, they have to approve MPs, all MPs, to stand as Labour MPs ahead of the next election. That's always been the way that we've done things. And frankly, if you'd listened to this debate over the last few years, you would think that we wake up every morning thinking about one man. Well, I can tell you that I don't. It's time for the Labour Party to move on. There is so much going wrong in this country at the moment. We're focused on that, and people are going to see that. Tomorrow we make a decision, the NEC makes a decision, and we move forwards.
Quick answers from the three of you, Robert.
Well, by coincidence, I bumped into Jeremy Corbyn on my way here tonight, and I said,
Should have brought him along.
I said, are you in, are you out? And he said, I'm still here. So I suspect that whatever the decision of the NEC is tomorrow, and it I think will probably be a decision to ban him. I think he still wants to be a figure in British politics, and there's the division in the left. Look, both the main parties in this country are very broad churches. They're big families, and we have our disputes and our quarrels, and I'm not pretending there aren't differences within my party, but Lisa's absolutely right to want to move on, because I can tell you in 2019 and those years leading up to 2019, the Labour Party strayed so far away from the common ground in British politics that it made itself irrelevant. Now the question is, how quickly can it make itself relevant? And the only way it can do that is by developing policies that actually stand up to scrutiny. We're still yet to see that.
Right, I'm going
to
let you two answer this question after the break, when Robert and Lisa have had to go. So let's go on to another question from Danielle in Chester, which is a text question. Is banning laughing gas a sign that the government has got the right priorities, or just empty electioneering, Robert Buckland?
No, I think it's a genuine and proper response to a real scourge. We went as far as banning the supply of laughing gas because, this has been a problem for a number of years now. I think clearly stepping forward and doing more is the right thing to do, because as medical evidence emerges about this, I don't think you can pretend this is some sort of benign joke. This is a problem.
It's less harmful than alcohol, so why not ban alcohol then?
Give it to pregnant women in labour.
But I think the way it's being used in our communities is a problem, and I speak to a lot of my residents, and I'm sure Lisa does as well with hers. I can tell you this is a problem, and the government is right to take action.
Lisa.
Don't take away my gas and air in Labour. It would be a brave person that came between a woman in Labour and gas and air, I can tell you. But I think that the government has finally hit on something that really does matter to a lot of people across this country. At the moment, communities are dealing with 3,000 incidents of antisocial behaviour a day, and many, many people in this country feel sad and scared when they walk down the high street in broad daylight. But the truth is that if you want to deal with this, you don't just need to think about banning harmful substances. You need to get police back on the streets. We've lost so many police officers in the last 7 years. We're 10,000 down on the number of neighbourhood police and PCSOs. That's why we say put 13,000 police officers back on the street. We found a way to pay for it. The government's quite keen to replicate what Labour's doing at the moment. I'm asking them, if they're listening, borrow that policy from us, because that's the thing that would make a big difference.
Right, we are going to lose the both of you now, which is a shame, but we know you've got to go and do your jobs. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we'll ask those two questions to Ben and Annabel in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
A series of former cabinet ministers caught on video asking for thousands of pounds.
I would do anything less than for about $10,000 a month.
Well, around $1,500.
I was thinking something like £60,000.
Conservative MP and Crime and Policing Minister Chris Philp. Noting that you were Kwasi Kwarteng's number 2 at the Treasury, is Mr Kwarteng worth £10,000 a day?
I don't think I'd be coughing up £10,000 for the pleasure of his views.
What do we make of some of your colleagues who've been caught in this sting?
I thought it was a pretty unedifying spectacle.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
48 on LBC. Annabel, Denham, Deputy Comment Editor of the Daily Telegraph, and Ben Nunn, former Labour Party Executive Director of Communications under Keir Starmer, now Senior Counsel at Lexington Communications. They are still with us, and they're going to answer the two questions that I wickedly denied them the chance of answering just a moment ago. Hassan wanted to know, now that Corbyn has been banned, is it time for a new leftist party to emerge, Ben Nunn?
No, it's not. I would count myself as left-wing, and I'm still very comfortable in the Labour Party. So no, it's not time for a new party. The question of Jeremy's, the decision Keir has taken today regarding Jeremy, comes back to the crisis of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And I worked for the Labour Party during that period, and it was some of the darkest days for the party. But frankly, on a personal level, for me, actually, there were days when I used to wake up thinking, what on earth am I doing? And I've got friends who are Jewish and friends who aren't Jewish, and they would often question me, what on earth are you doing? And for Keir, I know how deeply personal it is for him as well. And it is.
He was in the shadow cabinet at the time.
He was, and he spoke out against it. And I was with him. During those interviews when he spoke out calling for the IHRA definition to be adopted by the party. I was with him in the interviews where he called for the party to take tougher rules, and I was with him in the interviews where he said we're not doing enough. So he was in the shadow cabinet, and yes, he spoke out publicly and privately.
Did he ever consider quitting because of it?
I think that's more of a question for him. But
You're so skillful at dodging the question, you should be a politician, Ben.
But what I would say is I know how difficult those days were and how hard he found it. So, I don't, whether or not Jeremy Corbyn's a drag on Labour's popularity is for others people to say. But do we need to prove in so many ways that we are going to take a zero tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, and we are never, ever again going to end up in the mess that we did during that period? Yes.
Okay, Annabel?
It always surprised me that Keir Starmer didn't quit the shadow cabinet, because he strikes me as a very principled, not privileged, individual. He might be a privileged individual. But recently we have found a lot of people asking whether the real Keir Starmer will stand up. And I think that this feeds into that. He's struggled to define what a woman is. He has flip-flopped on his position on illegal immigration, asylum seeking. He claimed that farming was in his DNA when that patently wasn't the case at all. So I think that he needs to make it clear to voters, who he is and what he stands for. And only then will he stand a chance of uniting what I think is a very fragile coalition of Labour voters. And actually, I think the Tory party have a similar problem in that you have the sort of blue wall Conservatives who are often against things like planning. They live in the shires. But of course, from 2019, you have all of the red wall voters as well, and then tend to be sort of more nationalist and more populist. And how is the Conservative Party going to unite them? But what I don't want to see is a repeat of 2019, where the Labour Party took such a hammering in the general election that actually we were left without a proper opposition throughout the coronavirus pandemic. And I think that led to not adequately scrutinising some of the very draconian restrictions that the government introduced.
Right, the other question which you didn't have time to answer was from Danielle in Chester. Is banning laughing gas a sign that the government has got the right priorities, or just empty electioneering? Someone informs me here that you can buy laughing gas on Amazon, as if I needed to know that. Let's start with you, Annabel.
I think that the Tories are responding to the fact that the Labour Party park their tanks on the Tories' lawns. They've done this repeatedly over the last few months. The Tories have been accused of cribbing from the Labour 2019 manifesto. I am very sceptical of this action plan to address antisocial behaviour. Don't get me wrong, I do agree with Robert that this is a scourge and it needs to be addressed properly. But like Lisa said, we do not have the police officers on the street to enforce the laws that we already have, let alone trying to hand them new powers to try and enforce. So And when it comes to the laughing gas, I'm sceptical, because actually it seems like the politicians, the Conservative Party's issue with it is littering, which is already against the law. It's littering of the small canisters.
Well, Tom Swarbrick earlier was talking about wading through these thousands of canisters in local parks. I'm thinking, I've never seen one. I didn't know this was a problem. Maybe I'm out of touch.
I'm like you. I've never seen
Ben,
one
in
either.
your local park, are you assailed by these canisters and people laughing their heads off?
I wouldn't say I wade through it, but I do see it where I live, which is in Camden. I do see it. And I do see it. I do see it, and I see it in local parks, and I see the canisters littered on the street. It actually took me years to work out what they were. So I do see it. But just as Annabel just said, it's one thing banning it. If you haven't got the people to enforce these laws and these bans, it's not going to work. And the problem Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives are facing now with the electorate, and I thought it was interesting, it repeatedly kept being said earlier today when he did his town hall event, is the public just asking, you've had 13 years and it doesn't feel like you've got a grip of crime. And that is the big challenge facing the Conservatives now, is that sense that you've been in power for over a decade and people don't feel better off. They don't feel better. They don't feel their streets are safer. And that's, I think, partly explaining the Conservatives being behind in the polls at the moment.
Let's move on to a call from Robbie in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Evening all. My question is, I'd like to know, given the recent resistance actions, if you like, the protests in the Netherlands, in France, and now in Israel, when do you think it was the British people lost their will to protest and fight for their rights and freedoms?
Well, the French certainly know how to protest. Somebody picked me up the other day and they said, if this was in this country, you'd call it riots. Why are you calling it protest? And I thought, well, it's hair-splitting in a sense. Ben, is there anything that we have to learn from the French here?
I think we have our own way of expressing our political, when we want to protest against something or campaign against something, and the French have theirs. I'm not sure it's necessarily something to learn from. But what I would say, though, is we've got a lot of problems in this country, and a lot of people are struggling, and there is that broad sense that Britain isn't working anymore, and some of the fundamental services we rely on just aren't functioning as they did and as they would expect. And I think what the French protests have shown is that we're not alone in that, actually, that there are, the challenges facing Western countries at the moment are huge, and ultimately it comes down to economic factors, but it does show the scale of the challenges facing Western democracies.
Annabel?
I'm quite pleased that the British are reserved enough that we don't take our protests to such violent extremes as you see, in France. I can appreciate that if you were across the Channel, you might look at the protests here in Britain and think that they were rather pathetic. Whereas in France, clearly they're so desensitised to it that I don't know if you've seen that footage of a Parisian cafe where there were sort of rioters in the background setting fire to things and protesting, and things looked pretty dicey, but there were still cafe goers who were just happily sitting down and ordering a drink. So we saw this a couple of years ago with the Gilets Jaunes. Now you've got these massive protests that are a serious threat to Macron's presidency. Are we going to see something like that in the UK? I think it's highly unlikely. In fact, if you look at the recent industrial action, it looks like that's starting to fizzle out, that the government has been able to enter into negotiations with unions one by one and come to arrangements that seem to keep everybody happy, at least until the next pay rounds.
Well, we're going to be talking about what's going on in Israel after 9 o'clock. Now, Robbie, thank you for that. A text question from Jane who says, is a gender self-ID policy still something which left-leaning parties should pursue? I believe many women are unwilling to vote for parties which do support this, and many left-leaning women are becoming politically homeless and quite horrified to be in agreement more with the Conservative views on this topic. Plus, had the SNP not lost so many members, perhaps the leadership vote outcome would have been different. Ben, well, clearly Keir Starmer is looking to shift the party away from its unconditional support for self-ID.
This is a really tricky issue.
Bear in mind we have 3 minutes left.
This is a really tricky issue, and I think you wrote a very good article in the Telegraph about this issue the other day, which I'd advise readers to listeners to read. It is a tricky issue. I think what happened in Scotland is evidence of how tricky it is to enforce and legislate on these policies. And also, there is undoubtedly a case for women-only spaces and for, women's rights to be protected. And we have got to get the balance right on this. But this is a really tricky issue, and it's tricky not least because of some of the people involved have had horrendous experiences, face horrendous discrimination. So I think what this debate has proved is how you can't do politics in a soundbite with something like this. It's got to be properly thought through, and you've got to get the rights of everyone balanced.
Annabel, 90 seconds. No soundbites, though.
I don't think it is that complicated. I think it's reasonably straightforward. I believe that I'm a woman. I'm a biological female. I also believe that there are people who are biological males who have transitioned to become women. I don't think some of these trans activists ought to impose their views on me, and I won't impose my views on them. When it comes to self-ID, Iain, I agree with you. I'm not comfortable with the idea that people can switch genders at the click of a fingers with no restrictions whatsoever. I think that's an entirely reasonable position, and I find it quite astonishing, really, that with all of the issues that are facing our country at the moment, there's war back in Europe, that this is the one that is tying all of our politicians in knots. I think all parties should set out their stall, have a reasonable, tolerant approach, and we can move forward from the issue once and for all.
It's interesting, the Liberal Democrats, or certainly Liberal Democrat Voice, which is their main sort of party members' website, there's an article on there over the weekend basically saying, well, if you don't believe in self-ID, we don't want you in the party. And I'm thinking, well, how liberal is that? Totally intolerant, but there we go. Right, have we got time for our final fun question? Yes, they're saying we have. This is from Shelley in Canterbury. The bosses of ChatGPT have admitted a bug saw users' requests to the app leaked online. So be honest, what have you considered asking the chatbot to write for you, which maybe you're perhaps a bit embarrassed about? See, I've often wondered with these things how far they'll go. Can you literally ask them to write anything? And I did test that out once. Shall I admit this on air?
Definitely.
You need to tell me what it is.
I said, write 500 words of gay porn in the style of William Shakespeare. It wouldn't. Which is good, actually, I think. Do you think I'm going to get sacked for that?
Fortunately, that's not a decision for me. I'll
Thanks
be honest.
for your support, Ben.
That's right.
It's not very good at English literature, apparently. Very good at passing SATs and the bar exam, but when it comes to English literature, it struggles.
It is a fascinating phenomenon, though.
I've not used it, but I will, as homework, I'll probably ask a slightly different request from you, but I will go home and try it.
I've never used it either. I'm sorry. I will also go home and
It's fascinating because in theory it could do all written journalists out of a job. I hate to tell you this,
Fantastic.
But it could possibly, in the end, do radio presenters out of a job too. On that note, thank you very much indeed to Annabel Denham and Ben Nunn, and of course Robert Buckland and Lisa Nandy, who had to go and vote in the House of Commons. Right, in the next hour we are going to move on, and we're going to talk about the situation in Israel. We just touched on it a moment there with all these protests that have gone on, and they have succeeded in persuading the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to delay his controversial plans to reform Israel's judiciary. As well he might, because if you look at what he was proposing, it's pretty draconian, and people are saying that he's trying to become an elected dictator. Well, that's what his opponents are alleging. I want to know what you think about this, because Netanyahu is a very divisive character in Israel. He has huge numbers of fans who are totally devoted to him, but others see him as a dictator. How do you see him? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the new leader of the SNP says he will ask for another independence referendum right away when he's formally elected as Scotland's First Minister tomorrow. Humza Yousaf narrowly beat Kate Forbes once second preference votes were taken into account. Ash Regan was eliminated after the first round. But the former Cabinet Minister and Conservative MP Sir Robert Buckland has told Cross Question on LBC it's time his party started talking about more things than just independence.
I am absolutely convinced that the people of Scotland aren't genetically different from the rest of us and the rest of the UK, and they care about the same things that we do, which is the cost